John Vervaeke and Sean Coyne have together authored a new book, Mentoring the Machines. It's a book about artificial intelligence and the path forward that further develops the arguments of how to align artificial intelligence to human flourishing, and it sets those arguments into beautiful and accessible writing.
Welcome, everyone, to another Voices with Vervaeke. I'm really excited about this. This is my good friend, Johannes Niederhauser, and we have spoken so often together, either the two of us or with other people like Daniel Zaruba. We almost always very quickly get into real dialogos, and we share a common vision about the practice of philosophia and the cultivation of wisdom and meaning. I greatly admire Johannes. I admire his integrity. I admire the pathway that he's carving for himself, the authenticity by which he does this. Many of you know that I'll comment on many of his videos, and I got to spend time with Johannes February of this year at length in person. It was wonderful. So we're going to try and talk about Heidegger, and one of the hardest things, and yet one of the most central things, at least to my mind, to talk about in Heidegger. But first, I'm just going to welcome Johannes, and you just tell us a little bit again about yourself, Johannes.
Thank you very much, John. It's a great honor to be here with you again and to speak, and also to John briefly let me know the question he wants to get into. So this will be Pandora's box that we're going to open when it comes to Heidegger. Maybe just briefly on what I do. I wrote my PhD on Martin Heidegger, on death and being, and it turned out during the research that death resurfaces throughout his philosophical life. Because he wants to understand being in terms of finitude, and time also in terms of finitude. And he sees death as absolutely, I think, central to, and death is, he sees death as related with language, and death related to concealment also, which is his way of trying to overcome what Derrida called the metaphysics of presence. And what I've since been doing, or for the last 3 years now almost, is I've been building my own online philosophy academy, and where we teach Heidegger and Hegel and early Greek philosophy, and also Japanese philosophy. And John has been, since the beginning, very supportive of the works. I'd like to thank you also for that, and I look forward to our dialogue.
So Johannes has a course, I really recommend it, on Heidegger's Being and Time, and that's what we're going to concentrate on. I'm not restricting us to it. We might reach out to other aspects of Heidegger, later Heidegger, to try and. So what I'm saying is we're not just doing exegesis. We'll wrestle with a problem, and I will both probably dip outside of it. I want to at some point. But here's the first pass at the question, and even getting the question right is going to be something that we're going to probably tumble around on. And I invite everybody, when you're with Heidegger, like, he often described his project as like the way you wander through a woods, and there are different pathways, and they lead you, and they come in different directions, and they cross at different places, but there isn't a simple, straight, linear path. And you may say, well, isn't he just confused? No, I mean, there is real reason, not in our modern sense, but in the Socratic Platonic sense. There's real reason why that is a good way to try and wrestle with the questions he's wrestling with. So I'm asking people to frame it that way and follow us in that way. So here's an initial presentation. So Being and Time, obviously the book is about being and time, or else it's really mistitled. And then Heidegger is making a core argument about how to do what he calls fundamental ontology, to get a deep understanding of being. Now, again, for him, This is not, even the word understanding isn't, you shouldn't hear it the way we typically hear it, which is from an analytic tradition. Okay, what he's going to do is he's going to lay out some definitions, he's going to excavate things, he's going to remove confusion, and we'll have clarity. Yeah. That's not. What's going on with Heidegger is this hermeneutical, phenomenological. He's trying to get us to see, I think a better word is realize, because of some of the critiques he makes of the visual metaphors, right? Right, to realize,
to hear also,
yeah, also to hear, to see, to realize being, and that unlike Husserl's phenomenology, that is really oriented towards the transcendental ego, the structures of consciousness, Heidegger is focused on being. So first of all, is that a fair initial? I haven't even posed the question yet. I'm just saying that's what we're directed towards.
Well, yes, that's fair. And also, if you say you haven't even posed the question, the being in time itself is the attempt to even begin to articulate the question. Yeah. Of course, this is philosophia in its purest form, because philosophy is always preparation.
Yes,
and remains preparation, I would say, to a large degree. And I would just, as I have been going through Being in Time again for the course. Maybe I should have mentioned this earlier. Just if people want to enroll, we begin with seminars for 10 weeks sometime mid-January. And so there will be links down below in the description, etc. But let me just say that the clear difference between, and it is between Husserl and Heidegger, is precisely as he said, is that he's already completely outside of subjectivity. Yes. Or let's say the transcendental ego or transcendental I. And that becomes clear in the introduction to Being in Time, in the absolutely crucial section 7, which is on the method or the concept of phenomenology, where he destructs, as it were, he takes apart the very word itself and looks at phenomenon and logos together, and then brings them back together. But he doesn't look at the genealogy of the concepts. He actually explicitly says, I don't care, when it was developed by Christian Wolff, and how it developed further and how Hegel used it, etc. No, I'm just going to look at the foundational meaning of the words and then let that disclose something. And that is itself already a phenomenological exercise. So he brings, and it's so razor sharp and it's extremely precise how he makes a distinction between, phenomenon obviously means appearance or phenomenon, but not everything that appears is a phenomenon. Something that appears could just seem to be something. And then what is a real phenomenon? But also what has become a real phenomenon, so that introduces this sense of temporality, but also, let's say, dynamism, really. Anything that you've grasped as a real phenomenon can also turn into a mere seeming at the end. So, and what we're after, and I will give you the floor to pose the question, obviously, but what we're after is being and time, but absolutely not in any traditional sense.
Yes.
So we're not after permanence or substance or timelessness.
Or subject, right?
Or subject, yes. Or yes, exactly.
So, this is important because, Heidegger is actually also exemplifying part of his thesis, is that all of these ways that we are traditionally talking and thinking about being have in some ways blinded us or made us fall away from a genuine relationship with being. And so I'm going to take that rejection of the tradition and sort of funnel it into the problematic that we're going to wrestle with here. So Heidegger's, and each one of these things that I'm going to reject are sort of genuses for ways in which people have mistakenly or misapprehended being. So one is to think of that what we're talking about being is we're talking about things in the sense of individual beings, and either or sets of them or even the universe as a set of entities. And then what Heidegger wants to say is thinking of being as a being is a fundamental mistake. It misunderstands being in a fundamental way. So that's one thing we're trying not to think. Okay. And then the other one is, well, we might say something, well, we're getting at the origin of beings. And then we might think of that as something like the first being or the supreme being, some traditional notions of God. And Heidegger wants to reject that. Yeah, go ahead.
The ens perfectum, just to throw in the Latin, the perfect entity.
Yeah, and so the perfect entity, so that's not. So then what you might think is, oh, well, being is just the most abstract category. You go up all your taxonomic categories and you get to the highest possible genus, and that's being, and that's all we're talking about. We're just talking about an abstract category. And Heidegger says, no, that's not what I'm talking about at all. Go ahead, Johannes, you want to interject?
Yeah, you'll find this in section 1 of Being in Time of the introduction, where he lays out the 3 prejudices about being. And the tradition in that sense agrees, or Heidegger agrees with the tradition, because the tradition would say, it cannot be defined, that it is not the highest genus, but it is still the most universal somehow. So there's unclarity in the tradition itself, but even though the tradition even though it saw these issues with being, the tradition never pursued it further, according to Heidegger. It never pursued it. It just seemed obvious that it's just the most universal.
Yes.
But maybe it's not. But still, so there's already here right at the beginning was introduced is obscurity or darkness or hiddenness or concealment.
Excellent. Now the fourth one I'm going to say doesn't appear. It appears, it's marginalia. It appears in the margins, and then it gets taken up later, but I think it's fair. I think it was in his thinking at the time. And he also says the last temptation is to think of being as beingness, right? Some sort of property that all beings share. And he wants to reject that as well. And so I hope that many of you, if you're following this, are wondering, like, well, what the hell remains, right? like what? What are there alternatives to those 4? Like, what's left over? And so, for me, that's always been the problematic. And here's what I want to say about that. I think, first of all, there's something deeply right about it. The problematic is not, here's why I'm building towards refuting Heidegger or anything like that. But the issue I'm convinced that the appropriate way to resolve this is not just conceptually. There has to be something trans-conceptual going on. I think this is given by the very phenomenological approach he's taking. And I'm trying to understand I think this is fair. What is the transformation required of me in order to see? No, I'm going to use that word I used earlier. In order to realize my way through this, and so that I get an apprehension. I'm trying to use the broadest term as I can, being that properly articulates what Heidegger is trying to convey. So that's how I want to pose the problematic.
Okay, I'll say something in a second. So Heidegger, it's the first word of being in time is a Greek word, and it's delon. Delon means obvious. It's a quote from Plato's Sophists.
Yes.
Delon gar. So the quote reads 2,500 years ago. It seemed obvious to you what we mean by the word being, but now we have become perplexed.
Yes.
So in the dialogue on sophistry, and what is sophistry? I always point out it's not just about running from market town to market town selling knowledge. What sophistry does is it destroys access to the phenomena.
Yes.
Because if you just teach, let's say, virtue, but you don't know what to go to Plato's Meno dialogue, you give someone, let's say, the rhetorical tools to talk about virtue, but not become virtuous or understand what virtue is. Hence, sophistry destroys access to phenomena. So right from the beginning of being in time, the first word is it seemed obvious. It is no longer obvious.
Yes.
And Heidegger reminds us we must, again, this is something that the tradition did not pick up on. So we have 2,500 years of quibbling about being, either not, and but it must, in some sense, every generation must ask the question again, and not just take Heidegger's word for it. Precisely because the phenomena change, they are historically conditioned, let's say, and hence the question must be asked again, but it's also tied back right from the start to the tradition, but also overcoming the tradition, insofar as the philosophical tradition of ontology and metaphysics was not capable to consider what? Being and time. Because what he arrives at also in the introduction is that being was thought of as ousia, which he doesn't translate as presence, but as Anwesenheit, which means, which doesn't translate as substance, which is the usual translation, but as presence.
Yes.
And ousia can also mean homestead, but here in Being in Time, he still understands ousia really as Anwesenheit, which means presence, let's just say presence. But when we think of presence, what we would have to consider is time. And this is where the tradition really, where the Greeks sort of, I don't want to say failed or made a mistake, but time did not become an issue for them. It didn't become a question, didn't become a problem, didn't become thematized. Time was a being amongst beings. Time was understood as the now, for example, for the most part, but it didn't become itself an issue. So once we try to understand being as presence, that gives rise to the way in which beings are present, then we have to ask for time. Hence, one could also speak not only of the forgetting or the oblivion of being, but the forgetting of time.
Excellent. So let me just respond then to that. And this, of course, is something that this is a softball in a sense to you, because what I mean, one can think here of Augustine. I know what time is until you ask me, right? In the sense that, well, what do you mean? Surely the Greeks knew about the past and the present and the future and all that. And what's more familiar to me than time? Every moment I'm aware of time, and everything's happening in time, right?
Yeah.
And right. Yeah. But Heidegger's point is this is also that same familiarity that actually blinds us is the case for being as well. So like
yes.
So what I'm saying is these two things seem to be related in my mind. We deal with the familiarity and weirdness of being
Yes.
by relegating being to the opposite of becoming, right? This is sort of
yes.
Right, and then becoming and temporality get identified together, and then being gets identified with the eternal, and then that means that the question of time, we don't have to really address it because it has been dichotomized, separated profoundly from time. Time has been made irrelevant to the question of being, and then the project of relating to being is then understood as the project of relating to eternity, which then, of course, easily also gets subsumed under relating to the most eternal thing and God, etc. Is that a fair move to make?
Yes.
So one of the things we have to do then, this is sort of a fifth thing then, is we have to ask what being is and try to forget that dichotomy that makes it so natural to align being with eternity and put time with becoming, with appearance, with opinion, etc.
Yes. This just touches on the well, philosophy is a bit mad. The German word for this is verrückt, which translates to crazy or mad, but verrückt can also mean to be displaced. So the initial displacement of philosophical questioning is, well, as you know, why is there something rather than nothing, or how is it that there is something?
Yes.
But in order to be able to ask that question, you also have to be withdrawn already from just everyday concerns or beings. So the horismos, let's say, the distinction or the difference between being and beings has opened up. That's the beginning also of being in time, which for Heidegger now has to be thought again or thought anew in a post-metaphysical time. So that's another part of the project. And hence also time comes in, because what Heidegger sees is after Nietzsche. So when you were speaking of becoming becomes the realm of temporality, that's appearance. I mean, that's Platonism, and that's not Plato, but Platonism in a nutshell. This is the world of, the two-world theorem.
Exactly.
The ephemeral world of appearances somehow connects to the eternal world, etc. And Nietzsche says both worlds have become a fable. Everything has collapsed, and what's left is a will to power and the eternal recurrence of the same, which is for Heidegger the last ditch attempt of metaphysics to think and understand time through an eternal recurring. So basically, an eternal becoming that is no longer really a becoming. Hence we are really at a dead end, and we talk lots about crisis. But this is not a recent, and I've said this to you so many times, we've talked about this so often. It's not a recent development. The crisis, for some reason, starts to spread as a phenomenon sometime after Hegel. One of Heidegger's teachers is Husserl, who gives a lecture course on the crises of the European sciences. Another teacher is Paul Natorp, one of the Neo-Kantians, who's never mentioned in Marburg. He speaks of in a lecture course from 1921 of a great field of ruin, so that the tower has fallen.
Yes.
And the Neo-Kantians, Hermann Cohen, he was aware of this also. I mean, they tried with reviving Kant to overcome Hegel and to revive philosophy again and provide the categories necessary to make sense. But so crisis at the time Heidegger writes the book has been around for 50, 60, 70 years. Mm-hmm. And so what the attempt really is not just let's get being right, and this sort of abstract academic discourse, but let's make sure we have an access to what is, and that we can articulate it.
Yes. Okay, so we've added to the problematic. And but we've explained its pertinence, and you've elaborated on why I do not think this is a conceptual issue. I'm not saying that concepts will not play a role because we're talking and we're reflecting, but this is not just a conceptual issue. This is a more fundamental issue. Now, let's say, in addition, we're not talking about like even that question, why is there something rather than nothing? Think about how you're just initially attempted to think there's a causal answer. That's a causal question. What was before this that made this? And of course, that actually isn't the question that's being asked, right? But so it's not a thing. It's not a super thing. It's not the perfect thing. It's not the highest abstract category. It's not beingness. And now it's not that which has been pointed to by the two worlds mythology. Okay, great. Good, right? So what, and I mean, and I'm not trying to be unfair because, Heidegger literally does not complete the book. And so I understand that. But Heidegger thinks that if we properly frame the question and the relation, that we will make progress, I take it. And so let me point to you on one move I see him making on the basis of phenomenology that might give us an initial sense of how do we step out of these things we've been talking about. And one has to do with that dichotomy that you're just in the two world, but that's not the only dualism, right? And one of the things I think Heidegger gets from the phenomenology is a fundamental inversion. In a good sense, not in like the critique he makes of Nietzsche. What is we have proceeded with a framework of here are the two, there's always subject and object, or time and eternity. We have all these, and then we try to build the relation out of them, and right.
Yeah.
And phenomenology,
or it runs into dialectics.
Oh yeah, yes.
Or the last ditch attempt to save metaphysics.
Hegel's sense of dialectic, not Plato's.
Yes.
And what Heidegger gets from phenomenology, and I think in one sense from Husserl, but he does something very important. He says, no, right? Those things like subject and object, subjectivity and objectivity, those are abstractions from something that is not a dichotomy within the phenomenon. I'm trying to use that term as broadly as you've been indicating here. If we really, really carefully pay attention and comport ourselves, to use one of his terms, to what's going on, we see that our experience, I hate that term because it's laden with everything we're talking about. But our experience, right, does not, it's not properly, like I see all of phenomenology is trying to get us to pay attention to how intelligibility is actually unfolding for us, and getting us to realize, in the sense I talked about earlier, that there is something before, primordial to all these.
And that
was a speech. Sorry, but
no. But this is. I mean, so there's a lot of things but this is what Heidegger will come to call the clearing, die Lichtung.
Yeah.
That which initially clears before anything else can at all appear or even become possible, also in terms of a philosophical method. Something else that's important that you briefly touched on is the other dualism or dichotomy, let's say the subject-object dichotomy. So something that people are concerned with, probably also who listen to you, or much, is the subject-object dichotomy or Cartesian subjectivity. So one of the reasons also for Heidegger to write Being in Time is that he says we have an ontology that's based on, let's just simplify it, on Cartesianism, which means the I am I thinking of myself, this is certain. And how the world is out there is thanks to the guarantee of the hypothesis God. But there is a split introduced now between subject and object, or human being and world, which leads to all sorts of issues ontologically, but also psychologically, etc. And what Heidegger says is that the sciences have run into crisis precisely because they are based on this ontology. Hence the need to establish or write or manifest a fundamental ontology which finds its foundations in what Heidegger calls or refers to as Dasein, which can only be thought of as being in the world. And now the reason why, and I mean, you mentioned this briefly, the book isn't finished, so the second volume wasn't written, which would have been a destruction or a destruction of ontology. So there are moments in which he destructs, for example, the issue that time was forgotten by the Greeks leads to Descartes understanding the world, overly simplified, as objectivity, yes, but as presence at hand. That means it's something that's just perfectly available. And hence, mathematics, nothing wrong with mathematics, but only a purely mathematical access becomes the only access to the world. So the world becomes a secured resource. And so he sees all of these, I mean, he sees all of these issues, metaphysics coming to an end, the crisis of modern ontology, and hence he has to write, he wants to destruct it, build it all down, as it were, to provide a new foundation. And I think, though, the reason why he doesn't write the second volume is because in writing Being in Time, what you just were getting at, which is going beyond Being in Time, that there must be something initially having opened itself up, the clearing, which for Heidegger is always related to and can never be separated from concealment and withdrawal. That's what he realizes writing Being in Time. And there are two moments in the book, which is section 44, which is on truth and aletheia.
Yes.
Where he begins to think, he retranslates aletheia, the audacity, you know, to go and say, well, look, this is how you understood truth for 2,500 years, let's say. But aletheia used to mean, lethe is the river of forgetting. Lanthano means I conceal. So let's just translate aletheia as unconcealment, but let's not forget the concealment. So any unconcealment is predicated, we could almost say predicated on concealment. And then there's another, the second division begins on death. So right after truth as aletheia, when concealment, you know, to think of truth, there are these weird passages where Heidegger says Dasein is simultaneously in truth and in untruth, which means Dasein is simultaneously in disclosure, but also in concealment.
Yes. Yes.
Any disclosure that we make, to make this very practical, any discovery we make, any scientific discovery that we make simultaneously covers over, we don't know the hell what it covers over. There's no way of, you know, it's not, oh, we've covered this. Oh, no, you don't even know, because the process itself is simultaneous. Discovery. Yeah.
Could I interject here? Because because for me, I mean, I know you have criticisms, but you know, Dreyfus's inspiration from Heidegger on this led to the discovery of the frame problem, and the frame problem, relevance realization. And my work on relevance realization, I think, dovetails with this, that the disclosure of truth is always relevant truth, and relevance is always bound up with what has been ignored as irrelevant. You cannot ever have one without the other. And so I see there being a fundamental connection there between what we're talking about in Heidegger and the kind of work I'm doing in cognitive science. Do you think that's fair to make that connection?
Yes, but it would have to be even more radical, because to speak of ignorance or ignoring has already, and that's what it sounds like to me at least, requires some sort of realization. But the right?
No.
I mean,
no, but that's the point. No, that's the point with relevance realization. It's not that kind of ignoring. It's not I ignore it in that sense. It's the sense that I never, it never becomes a possibility for me to consider it, because if I tried to consider all those things and then chose to ignore them, I would hit combinatorial explosion. No, it's a much deep, that's why I said it's very much like a Zen koan. Like there's a kind of intelligent ignorance going on that sounds contradictory and oxymoronic to our ears. So I think it is.
That's fair.
Yeah. And so for me, I'm trying to do a little bit more concrete of a connection for like the point you made about Heidegger's point about how this gets into the sciences. And the issues about subjectivity and objectivity are crucial issues in cognitive science, because that's the science that tries to understand knowing and subjectivity, right? And then this issue, at least I've been arguing, is something that has been slowly sort of making its presence felt within cognitive science, right? And the understanding that, wait, this is a fundamental thing that we're not properly recognizing in our science.
Yeah.
So if that's right, okay, then here's something I want to get at, and don't lose the part about the connection to death. Like I'm trying to get at, because you only did phenomena, you didn't do logos, right?
Well, logos is, I didn't mention it, but logos is the saying. So I don't like this translation of discourse in English. I would say saying or articulation in an apophantic sense. So to let something see but it's communal. Not every way of speaking is that specific logos apophantikos.
Yeah.
So Heidegger makes for example, he says oeuvre, which means to beg or to ask for something, is not that logos apophantikos in that relevant sense, but it is a communal speaking in which the speaker becomes the medium. And by the way, just to finish now the point on phenomenon, Heidegger says that we should understand the word phenomenon as coming from finest die, which is a middle voice form in the
Yes.
Greek grammar. So that's to say, the phenomenon itself doesn't, it appears, but it can also appear in something else, or actually appears through a medium. And that medium is logos itself. That medium is the communal speaking and hearing.
Okay, great. Because that's what I wanted to get at. I wanted to get at the middle voice, communal. I wanted to get at, like, and this is what I see what he's maybe trying, like, for me, this notion of intelligibility and the way it's bound to being seems to be getting closer to what we're talking about here, because the intelligibility of this and the intelligibility of this are not the same thing, right? But I'm trying to get something.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That gives me access, that gives me access in my experience, such that so that I can come to the clearing, so that I can come to the place for which I can apprehend being in this way we're talking about. This apophatic logos that you're talking about, right? Like that's why I was making the connection to relevance realization. I'm trying to get the sense that, that the way things are primordially intelligible to us is what Heidegger is trying to get us to awaken to, and that intelligibility is not a perfect presencing, but it's always a realization. There's always the shining in, but there's the moreness beyond what's shining in. That's what I'm trying to get at. But is that a red herring, trying to make that connection? Because I'm trying to get back to where the Greeks were not, where they have something to tell us about.
Oh, they have everything to tell us. So this is very important. By the way, so also the presence itself, let's say, is never present. But when we say being is never a being, the presence itself withdraws in the sense that show me the presence, show me time, show me. Yeah. But the inconspicuousness, in German is das Unscheinbare. We talked about this in London also. It's not something that doesn't appear, but it doesn't shine, but it still gives rise for something to shine forth. The weather, for example. I mean, show me the weather. This is a bit of a facetious example, but there's different phenomena of the weather. By the way, I'm in Italy, and in Italy you don't say it's raining, you say piove, just simply piove. There's no it's. There's nothing doing. It is piove, raining, rain.
Right.
Rains. But yeah, I would that connection I think is fair. And so the presence is never present. And what I really want to avoid is, and of course, Heidegger, when he writes Being in Time, he's a young man, and what young men are like. You have to make a mark for yourself. So his tone changes over time. So in the beginning, he actually does speak on the very first page of Being in Time. He says there's a Versäumnis, so a failure, or the Greeks missed this phenomenon. And I think there's also a moment when he speaks of almost a catastrophe or so in Plato. But that disappears the older he gets, and it becomes, I think, instead of understanding Heidegger as someone who says everything is wrong up until me, it's better to understand him as saying every way of understanding being has its epoch and its time, and we can learn from those to make it simple for us now. But we have to find our own, come back to what you said, primordial path to the phenomena, but always in dialogue with the tradition. And he in that regard speaks of Zuspiel, which I think he takes from football, which he calls soccer in Northern American English. Zuspiel is the when you're playing the ball to someone so that he can score.
Yeah.
So playing forth.
Okay. So this is helpful, because then I want to propose another way in which we can get mistaken about this, which is we can confuse intelligibility with semantic meaning.
Yes. Okay. Now we have to talk about propositionality, etc. Yeah, go on.
That's right. Yeah, that's the point I'm making. That right. So one of the ways in which, like, given everything we've said, the temptation is right that what intelligibility is semantic meaning. It's a relation between propositions, and and notice what is sought for. I can get clarity. I can get pure a pure disclosure, a pure presencing of the relations through the conceptual analysis, and then that will give me the meaning, and that is what intelligibility is all about. And if the argument up to now is right, then and this converges with arguments I make about how relevance can't be a propositional property, right? Then we get another profound way in which, like, this isn't a confusion about being, this is a confusion about how we try to understand the relationship between intelligibility and being, because if we misapprehend apophatic logos as semantic relation, then we are again blocked from the kind of thing that Heidegger is trying to get us to see. That's a proposal I want to make to you.
Yeah, fair.
But then there's a problem. There's a deep problem, and here's so here's now more of a challenging question to Heidegger. Yeah. What are you doing outside of the propositional to make this possible? What are you doing outside of the propositional to get us free from that confusion? Because I would argue that if in your approach or your method, you take that as your first identification, your first step, you're going to get locked into all these other things in a very profound way. Now that's a little bit preposterous proposal, I know, but I'm willing to argue it. But for the sake of argument, give it to me, and then, like, it's like, I think that I want to know. This is what I meant about. I don't think you can answer this question conceptually. I'm not saying concepts don't matter, but there's what else are we doing if we grant. Sorry, Johannes. If we grant the intelligibility is not conceptuality, it's not semantic meaning, then what do we have?
What we have to grant, and now I'm going to attract all the wrath from everyone who deems himself a rationalist. Experience. Heidegger we'll say more, but Heidegger continues to say that he's made a certain experience in his thinking. By the way, I can now bring this briefly back to death. Death is the beginning of the second division, and something happened. So I wrote my book on death, and I thought, it's a few things in being in time, obviously very important, but death continues to reappear. And the reason I think for this is when you read this and you don't read it. So there's different ways of reading also. I mean, being in time itself is a self-investigation of Dasein. Dasein gets to know itself for the first time, and it gets to know its existentialia. So, and all of a sudden, and this is the only reason why he can understand truth all of a sudden in terms of being in the world, which has to do with hermeneutical discovery, that is itself a different form of understanding, or to use your intelligibility, than we would usually think of, because it is one that really is in average everydayness, which is not propositional. The world does not light up to us purely or appear purely propositionally. It appears in a weird familiarity. It appears inconspicuously, etc. But in death, reading these passages on death, what one can witness, I think, is that Dasein here is pushed towards its, as Heidegger calls it, almost possibility of being, which at the same time shows Dasein that its impossibility of existence. So in this intensity of getting closer to one's most authentic possibilities, it all slips away. And I think Heidegger sees this exactly in. This is why he doesn't write the second volume, I think, is because he ignites here as a thinker. Namely, he ignites as a thinker who sees, I have to follow this with this withdrawal. I have to follow that draft, that disappearance, that way of disappearing. And then the language changes. The language in the second division of being and time changes. It's less academic. It becomes not the entire division, obviously, but parts of it are really bloody weird, and hence also the later turn to the poets, because for Heidegger, poetry can articulate this better than maybe propositional language can. So that's just a few introductory remarks. I don't think
no, that's great.
I've yet, yeah. Go on.
No, sorry, I didn't mean to stop you.
No.
So I'm trying to get at that. Okay. So right, and yeah, so I mean, in the poesis, you're getting into the sense making, and you're getting into, right, this inevitable tonos, this creative tension between things becoming present to us. Well, they also would, I mean, the whole point about poetry is it's constantly doing that. Things are being said and conveyed, but they're also being withdrawn. Yes.
In a non-propositional manner. Grammar very often, and this is not Dadaism or 20th century poetry, in form really disappears, but this is the poetry of Goethe, this is the poetry of Hölderlin, for example, where grammar disappears. And still the phenomena themselves, they're there. We can see the world.
So what then? So first of all, I don't think I'm thinking about dialogue. What is it? A dialogue with this? What's it called? That little dialogue with a Japanese person. What's the title of that?
I think it's just something like Gespräch. Dialogue with the Japanese scholar.
Yeah, I think so. And
as far as I know, yeah.
And it's probably an allusion to D.T. Suzuki or something, right? And there's this deep discourse in Zen, and of course the Kyoto school is deeply influenced by Heidegger and Zen. I'm trying to get at, does Heidegger? I'm not denying this. I'll use your language, and it's poetic, so it's example, the igniting of experience. Right, I'm putting two things you said together: the igniting of experience in his work. But are there things other than reflection on poetry that we should be doing to more properly ignite experience? For example, like the Nishitani would argue that you have to do, there's various meditative and contemplative practices that are needed in order for you to get these deepest disclosures, the deepest kind of aletheia.
I'll get to this in a second by a bit of a detour to make this clear again. I mean, so to make this a bit clearer, how Heidegger understands what he comes to call metaphysics or philosophy in general, which, let's say, begins with Plato and Aristotle and continues all the way to Hegel and maybe also Nietzsche.
Right.
Some degree Nietzsche, but Nietzsche is already at the very edge. So he's already actually in the collapse of metaphysics.
Yeah.
All of this for Heidegger speaks within or from out of the same experience of being. But that remains unquestioned. And that's why the question is not asked. It's not because no one was as clever as me. Look at me. No, it's because it made sense. It was a long tradition that made sense, but it has come to an end. And now we're in desperate need, let's say, of being, but also of being touched by being again.
Yes.
And now this ties in, or this leads to your question: in what way can one attune oneself to?
Yes.
Now, I think when you look at Heidegger himself, it's a giving up, first of all, on subjectivity. That would be the beginning, and one would have to give up on thinking of oneself as an acting I. I think also that doesn't mean you cannot say I, but that would be perhaps one initial starting point, if you like. We can also sense that it's in a rereading of the tradition that, well, that becomes, so you see where academic philosophy is, for example.
Yeah.
Academic philosophy, it's analytical. This is very strange to think about it. Analytical philosophy begins in the moment when metaphysics has collapsed, and it collapses into positivism, basically, which wants to be anti-historical.
Yes.
It wants to be. This is significant because this actually, they speak of the end of history before anyone. Basically, they say we don't need nothing anymore. It's complete futurism, just being cut off from anything.
Yeah.
But that didn't work out, right? Not everything can be formalized, and now you have entire departments of the history of analytical philosophy. At the same time, there's now a reading backwards of the tradition, which very often can purely amount to applying certain isms or models of our time to was Spinoza an idealist or was he a realist? But not, let's have new realism. Which will, by the way, lead to new skepticism, and that will lead to a new idealism. So, we can turn this forever. But Heidegger says, why should we have all of these epigonal renaissances, and instead not try to read the tradition, what the tradition didn't pick up on? So there are these seeds almost that no one picked up on, and those we need to turn to, and see whether we can provide the fertile ground, so that it can grow and become our own, but also in a way always in this, there's a German word for it, which is Anverwandlung. So we appropriate something, but we appropriate it so that we become transformed.
Yes.
But also it, right? Yeah. So in some sense, the future begins to alter the past.
Yeah. A reciprocal reconstruction. I get that. So let me keep pushing on this, though. I like what you're saying.
Yeah.
For example, I have taken it, and other people have too. Somebody we both know, Guy Sandstock, and other people, Thomas Staudinger and others, take it as one of the ways in which we try and actually put into practice what Heidegger what Heidegger is doing is we try to give up on the monological model of reason, the monological model of how you philosophize. And the idea here is, like, if you're saying all these sentences like we're saying, but you're still bound into a monological frame, you're still working fundamentally within the Cartesian grammar. And that what we need to do is to, I don't even want, let me use the word reconceive, but I want to use conceive not only as thought, but to give birth. We want to reconceive, right, our ability to philosophize as something that is properly dialogical in nature. I'm not trying to be coy here. This is an argument I have been developing. This is a way I've been trying to say we need. This is a way in which we can put into practice, right, a breaking out of that grammar, so that we can now pick up seeds. The dialogical seed was clearly there in Plato's dialogues, and it's not picked up. Philosophers write some dialogues here and there along the way, and there's some Neoplatonic philosophers who really, Erigena, reality is inherently dialectical, things like that, right? But for me, that's a concrete example of what you're talking about. Right? It's not a proposition. Oh, look, we should have thought that trees are actually mammals. It's not that. It's like, no, right?
Yeah.
We pick up on something that would actually enact us breaking out of that Cartesian grammar in a directly transformative, and in the sense you're using the word, experiential way. Can it ignite experience for us in a way that we could see, realize, apprehend being in a new way, the intelligibility of being in a new way? So I'm saying that's something as a concrete proposal that I have been engaging in. And other people, I'm not taking sole credit. I've named a bunch of other people that are doing the same. That's what I'm saying, right? Right? Are there things beyond what Heidegger, that's trivial. Of course there has to be. But what I'm trying to say is I'm trying to get at like that. I'm going to maybe I'm being too coy with myself. It seems to me that we need an ecology of practices to properly follow Heidegger on what he is proposing.
Yeah, and we need a, if you forgive me, a deinstitutionalization of it also.
Sure.
There was of, I mean, not of what you're doing, but of philosophy itself, because once it's to come back to being in time. This is also important though. The they self, das Man. Which makes no sense in English. You should know, anyone who's English out there should know, in German we actually speak of man all the time, and it's an ominous self. You can have personal sentences that are completely just concern you yourself, and you will say man. It's not just others ominously out there. It's an existential of being human. It's to be taken over by a certain desire for being released from the burden of existence. And anything that institutionalizes for Heidegger, actually, one way or another, turns into, if it becomes too overbearing, is taken over by das Man. So I think what one must develop is this sort of, I talked to Guy Zengsok about this recently, is a bit of a playful engagement, but also with the withdrawal, with concealment.
Yes.
But one has to be mindful and accepting also that one is never oneself fully enlightened, let's say. We are taken in by the clearing is a clearing for self, for concealment. It cannot, so one would have to accept that also, that there's one cannot reach, let's say, a highest level or state or so, but that the authentic cannot be separated from the inauthentic, that clearly.
Okay, so let me see if that this is how it's landing with me. This goes towards something I think we've talked about. I think you and I and Daniel talked about it. That giving up another, the giving up of the sacred as the complete, as the finished, as the final, as the totalization, and that idea instead of trying to find deeply meaningful and vivifying the inexhaustible, rather than seeking rest, rather than seeking finality, rather than seeking completion. James Carson's idea of playing the infinite game, to pick up on your play metaphor. That seems to me to be also something that requires, like, the sacred is not that you change just by talking differently about it. That is to not properly apprehend it as the sacred. The sacred has to be that. Go ahead.
No, I think it's just, sorry, no, you should go on, but it's really crucial. And I think this is, why I'm trying to do what I'm trying to do.
Yes.
Which is to, Anna, sometimes I've been wondering these past couple of months, what am I doing? Wake up and I think, has this really been happening? Am I really teaching in the way that I'm doing? Why am I doing it? I don't know. But I think it's becoming clearer again to me, because there's no prestige in it. There's no status in it. There's nothing. It is probably just ridicule in it, from at least from the institutions. But what happens during the seminars is, because it's so completely free from any instrumentality, is that they become electric.
Yes.
So you see, this is we have to. I just wanted to second what you were saying. This is now just coming, so that we need to go into the, if you like, the practical or the deed of it also. So it needs to become communal, and where what really is at stake is this attempt to reconceive this experience of being, or bring it about, or try and be a midwife to this new experience. I think this is also how you can escape institutionalization. It remains an erotic play.
Yes.
Sorry.
I think that's right. And that's the notion of the sacred as bound up with, right, the falling in love with being again. And for me, that's part of what is coming to the fore. That.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. That's that falling in love again, because that means to fall, you have to let go.
Yes.
You have to be willing to fall.
You have to be willing. Yeah.
And you don't know it. Yeah.
But it's not empty thrashing. It's not that kind of fall. It's the kind of fall that's also the falling in love. It's the reciprocal opening. It's the participation. It's the commitment. It's all of that. So let me. We didn't even get to time yet, but we're making good progress.
We'll get to time. Yeah.
If we have time. That was a bad joke. Okay, because I want to, because I think there's something deeply resonant between love in this sense. This is also another seed from the Platonic Christian tradition I want to try and pick up in some fashion, and reconceive it. I think love has something to do with, so Heidegger talks about these, I don't know what the English, the three dimensions like that are important for understanding temporality, and even eternity is part of temporality if you properly understand it, right? But these dimensions of thrownness, projection, and concern, right? And they roughly correspond. I don't know what the right verb is here, to the past, the future, and the present, as experiential things, not just linguistic pointers. Because I think this is going to be an audacious claim. One of the ways we can re-understand love is precisely how it engages those three in a profound way. You fall in love, you're thrown into it, you're deeply concerned about it, and it projects possibilities for you and who you can radically be that you were not otherwise not available to you or discernible by you. Love is properly doing that in a very profound way. First of all, does that even land as a proposal for you?
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So I'm trying to make a connection with this capacity for falling in love with being again, and the way in which it gets us properly interpenetrated with our temporality in the Heideggerian sense, because of the way it calls us into, makes us reverberate with our thrownness, our concern, and our projection. What do you think about that as a proposal, about making that connection?
Yeah, very good. I think we should, let's move into time.
Okay.
Obviously, just to be pointed out these three dimensions of time already that Heidegger sees, which are connected to the three dimensions of time that as he calls it, the ordinary understanding of time also presents us: the past, the present, and the future.
Right.
What he sees as an issue, though, here is that these are disconnected from one another, and that the future flows into the present, flows into the past, and well, what we're mostly concerned with is the current now. The past maybe becomes of historiographical or so interest, but he wants to understand time as he understands time as ecstatic, meaning out of itself or taking us out of ourselves.
Yes.
And also, this is something perhaps that he mentions only in passing almost. He asks in the question, why is it that we think of time as fleeting? And he says it's because we haven't really faced death yet. It's our fleeting knowledge of death that leads to our fleeting understanding of time, because we haven't considered time as our almost possibility. And if you understand time, for example, purely as linear, then projecting possibilities it becomes very different from projecting possibilities in an ecstatic sense, which, by the way, ties to how we can understand or relate to the tradition as ecstatically throwing something at us and throwing us into something, which we can project as possibility towards a horizon of possibilities, and some of which we will act on and others we won't. But the most important perhaps part is perhaps to understand that the past is never just past. The past is gewesen sein, or in English, that which has been, and as such continues and comes towards us from the future. So Zukunft is coming towards. But well, by the way, also briefly, because this is something that is important when we speak about love and falling in love with being, the German word for possibility is Möglichkeit. And possibility is a perfectly fine translation for Möglichkeit for the most part. And it makes sense. But mögen, Heidegger understands, especially after being in time, sometimes also in its verbal meaning, so Möglichkeit in its verbal meaning of mögen, which means to like and to love.
Oh, wow.
So
I didn't know that. Oh, wow.
Yeah. So
that's a profound.
This is why in the letter on humanism, he calls das Sein ist das Mögliche, which in English, so das Mögliche is, so he absolutely wants to show us that he means mögen in the sense of to like and to love. Right. And that's translated into English as being is the possible, which makes no sense. So the translators didn't pick up on that. But it's
right there.
It's das Mögliche. Being is that means being is that which likes us, affords itself to us, gifts itself to us, if we like it and love it back.
Right. Okay, that is really powerful. And you know, the for me, I hear like, so let me just stop. What we're saying here is really relevant to, I think, a misappropriation of Eastern philosophy, which is the idea that only the now is real. Right? Only the now is real, and the future and so being in the now is all that matters. And I think that's a radical truncation of what mindfulness means. Sati means to remember, to remind, which is already an inherently temporal notion, and to make right, come, like you're just not right, and that, you know, and then of course eternity is often the eternal, the eternity is the I don't know, the now without limit or something, the unextended now, or the infinitely extended now or something like that is how people and for me, this, whenever I remember doing this when I did a course on the philosophy of time, and you know, you do, and Bergson talks about durée, and I'm trying to get at durée, right? I'm really trying to get at this notion, and I'm really, and you know, and of course he says it's intuitive and all that, but the point I'm trying to get at is, as soon as you try and do the now thing, you get to the specious present. Like when people do that move, they don't realize how corrosive it is, right? Because it goes like this. It goes like this, like this, like this. You don't get eternity. You get what Hahn talks about. You get the complete automatization of time until it becomes this, what did James call it? The specious present. That like, right, and then all of existence, all of reality is reduced, right? And such and why the hell would you love that? That is not anything in which anything that can bear love or that can even constitute love. For me, that do you like? I know you weren't saying this, but I'm saying what you're saying, or what you're voicing Heidegger is saying. It's a criticism of this whole thing that is becoming very prevalent right now, and without a recognition of how corrosive it is, and how atomatizing it is, and how ultimately it's nihilistic. It's deeply nihilistic.
Yeah, and it takes time again as a being amongst beings.
Exactly.
It's a reification of time.
Yes.
Whereas what Heidegger shows us is, and so, but this is maybe crucial, as you pointed out. I had conversations last year with a professor of mathematics at Berkeley, and I'm not going to mention his name, but he said it strikes him that probably Heidegger thinks after time, because time is for us becoming an issue. So, and that to me is crucial. Maybe there is something weird about our time, insofar as now time seems to be everything. We use, you're at 12 p.m. Toronto time, I'm at 6 p.m. Italian time. The time has become one of the parameters by which we run the globe. But this behind me here is not, it doesn't exhaust time. The time is a parameter by which we can steer the cybernetic globe. That's one part of it, but it doesn't exhaust the full dimensionality of time. And so it seems to become an issue really for us for some reason. And that perhaps is also something to ponder, but maybe this withdrawal into the now, which seems to be prevalent in certain people who look for help or guidance by focusing on the now. Maybe that's in some sense the attempt to again cancel out time, as it were, but then remain with time that is basically still predicated on the ordinary understanding of time as linear and just passing us by and flowing away and never to return. Whereas when we think of time as ecstatic, that is, as taking us out of, time itself is time proper, is arising and is giving. And I think here's also the connection to the later understanding of Heidegger and of being, which is being as gift or giving itself. And of course, the human being in a receivership. A gift is not, if I gift you something and you don't consider it or don't look at it, it is not a gift, or has to be accepted, received, appreciated.
And the deep connections he's drawing between thinking and thanking in that sense. The deep, right? Yes, right. But then that means, that means that there are virtues that need to be cultivated if we're going to properly realize time, right? Because if we cannot have patience and gratitude and receptivity, then what we're talking about here is not going to be anything other than words to people.
Especially, I think, gratitude and patience is an interesting word, because it comes from pasien, which means to suffer also.
To undergo them, right?
To undergo, and yes, so to stay on Heidegger, he himself gave lots of talks in the 50s and 60s to philosophical laymen, either to his in his hometown. There's the talk on Gelassenheit, releasement, where he says, don't condemn technology, say yes and no. Be released towards things and be open to the mystery. So here we have two, because you were asking before, and obviously, it's sometimes it comes a bit later, but two, say, modes of being or ways of responding that one can cultivate. Be released towards things, release yourself into the world in that manner, but also remain open to the mystery. So that and this is some of the, now we're getting into different topic paths, but in Heidegger says, in technology, there is a sense waiting to be discovered that we haven't seen yet, but that's just aside. But so yes, there are moments where you can find also in Heidegger, not in being in time, to be strict, because that's, it's purely descriptive, blah, 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 but one can cultivate, of course, coming from this certain comportments, to use also his language, certain ways of behaving. That's a beautiful English word. To be and have at the same time.
So Gelassenheit, which you invoked, that releasement, he gets it clearly, and I think Caputo makes a good case for this. I think it comes out of Eckhart properly, and that brings me in. One thing I want to talk to you about is the relationship between Heidegger and Christian Neoplatonism, because I think it's a lot more intricate than is often understood, especially through people like Eckhart. And of course, it's no coincidence that Suzuki also picks up on Eckhart in order to try and make DT Suzuki to make connections. But I want to try and get at, because, you know, Eckhart makes the argument that Gelesenheit requires this fundamental metanoia, this fundamental radical kenosis, this radical emptying. Like what I'm saying is it requires, I'm going to use this in Hadot's sense, it requires really profound spiritual exercises to realize it. Now, that doesn't mean that it's only for elites, because Eckhart is giving his sermons to the peasants, and he's proposing something that they can engage in even in their peasant life, if that doesn't sound elitist. I don't know what other term to use. And so, again, this brings me to, like the cultivation of Gelesenheit, I think, is a very radical in the sense of going to the root and also opening up possibilities that have not been opened up. I'm trying to use both senses of the word radical. I think that's a very radical proposal for a human being. I think it, like, does this lead to a conclusion that I think is prominent in the Neoplatonic tradition, especially the Christian Neoplatonic tradition? And Spinoza even has it. You can hear the last echo of it within the Cartesian framework within Spinoza, that truth is actually, the deepest truths are only disclosed in transformation, in profound so that truth is, in that sense, you know, we only know it. I don't want to say purely retrospectively, because we have the prospective longing, but we only completely realize it in the transformation that we're called to. We only know it, so to speak, by how we have moved away from illusion or delusion. We don't ever grasp it itself. It's like time in that sense, right? It is what affords the propulsion of intelligibility, but it's not anything that we actually itself grasp. This is what Spinoza tries to get at when he says truth is its own standard. You only see it when you realize what was previously false. You can't just sort of do it, like have it directly. So here's the argument I've made. Gelesenheit in Eckhart is bound up with profound transformation, and that's bound up with the Neoplatonic, often Christian Neoplatonic claim that the deepest truths are only disclosed in profound transformation. And this is the opposite of the Cartesian proposal that reached its culmination in Leibniz, the other to Spinoza, right? That, no, we can come up with a universal calculus, right? That does not require us in any way to undergo. All we have to do is know how to use that technology, and then we're fine. So that's the argument I've made to you.
And I think maybe just to add to this, with Gelassenheit, is also is letting oneself into, but also letting beings appear so that one, well, it's, to use this word, a decentering
Yes.
of oneself, to begin to see that we are Paschen, the suffering participants, also in a patient sense, but not only, of course, of the unfolding of being itself, and that hasn't ended. It is simply the responses that were given,
yes,
that really have exhausted themselves. And so, by, however, beginning to see, you could almost say, in this grander, almost cosmic, well, I would really say it's difficult because there's no word for Geschichte. So I always struggle. It's not history, because history in English means mostly the past, and of course we can say history is unfolding, but that means events. Geschichte is the past, the present, and the future coming together in one, ecstatically forming one. But of course, this coming together isn't, again, it's not a totality. Right. It actually is one, let's say, bubble that begins to form, that bursts, and that forms a million others. But so what I think I'm not sure. I'd like to hear more on the Neoplatonism and what the clearer connection, or maybe that you see, so that maybe I can say something more directly on it.
Yeah.
But Gelassenheit for Heidegger, he's in some sense, for him, the future, let's say, lies in a complete disregard for some complete abandonment, not disregard, abandonment of any sort of subjectivity. Hence, Heraclitus becomes also so important, where there is no acting subject. It's pure. It's the unfolding of, and he goes to Homer, for example, certain passages in which, when we translate it in the propositional manner as we're used to today, then it's Odysseus himself who's he's crying because he's sad. But no, the tears come over him. He's taken by it, and so that sort of way of thinking that's maybe if you like a certain practice also that one can in saying or in languaging, in articulating something, not going to the general you or some sort of propositional articulation, but an attempt to say something without the subject that acts.
Yes.
And instead going into this event character of the pure occurring and try and say it in that manner and see what changes. And that, to me, that could be releasement. That could be it's not a releasement, I release myself of myself.
Yeah. That's what I'm trying to get away from. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I think what you just described was something that you can see the Neoplatonic tradition, especially when it enters into Christianity, or Christianity, an articulation of participation in the Platonic sense, right? Participation is what I think you were what you're doing with your hands, right? And so what I'm trying to get to now is there's a kind of transcendence happening here, right? And yet, how do we get that without the two worlds mythology?
Yeah. So the task is to keep open the schism, or else the phenomena also collapse into a sheer immediacy. That's the story of the prisoners in Plato's cave. They take in what's seemingly immediate, but it is only through the schism that's opening up by the suffering, painful exiting the cave and the return. Let's not forget the return into the cave. That transformed return into the cave, that we begin to see that there's what is and what is not can now be separated. So how does this not turn into Platonism?
Yes.
So one always has to distinguish between Marx and Marxism, or Hegel and Hegelianism, or Plato and Platonism. They of course, this, it's maybe a thing that's impossible, because you cannot stop the unfolding, or how people receive what the initial thought is. That's one of the issues about the authentic, inauthentic. I mean, Nietzsche suffers through the eternal recurrence of the same. He's really, I mean, Lou Salome talks about this, how he suffered from this thought. And now it's a you can read it on Wikipedia. Oh, it's a thought experiment. Blah 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 blah. But so the heaviest, most terrible thought can turn into a 5-minute video on YouTube. But I think so. That to me is the profound question. Instead of, so that has to do, ultimately it comes back to how we teach, and how we teach, and how that teaching and those what goes into that teaching before, and if it's just if it's just a propositional teaching, that, to use your language from before, that it speaks within the grammar of Cartesianism, let's say,
Yeah.
so that, you know, tries to get something perfectly right, or that this is not correct, or then that sort of leads to the same issues that we've had before. But if I don't know, if the teaching itself is a different one, it can at least lead to, well, an intensity also with the students or the learners, to understand that this is not purely something that can be or that is just, you know, up for debate in an academic sense. But ultimately, I think because it is the schism or the horismos that must open up and that must be kept open. I don't know whether the sort of some sort of two-world issue or mythology or paradigm, I would almost say, it's not, you know, I'm not saying this is around the corner or so, but nothing can be, it cannot be made, one cannot get rid of it, I think, because it's inbuilt in thinking itself. Do you see what I'm trying to say? It's insofar as the schism needs to be held open, but also then bridged again.
Yeah.
And brought together. It cannot be purified to such a degree that now this will never happen again.
Right.
I think
right.
rather to come back to this, there's a return into the cave. So the cave doesn't disappear. Now that's striking. Why doesn't he comes back down and he's faced with death and everybody ridicules whoever was freed. But he goes back down out of also compassion, by the way.
Yeah.
So there's the virtue of compassion that's mentioned.
Yes, there's agape in there too.
Yeah,
right.
Yes. And so it has to be achieved again and again. Again and again. Hence, Heidegger said to a student once, we don't Heideggerianize here. So don't use my language for this. This is an attempt of saying it. You have to find your own language, which is not to say your own private little personal subjective language that no one understands, but this is something we have to, well, almost, you know, not fight out, but work out again and again. But you probably have your own thoughts, so I'd like to hear those before I keep monologuing on.
I think that's fundamentally right, and yeah, I'm trying to get this notion of transcendence that we find in time and love and being that isn't well described by the two worlds mythology. I agree with you that mythology is, in some sense, we will. I'll totally agree with this statement. We cannot purify our experience so that mythology will not arise again. It will continually arise. And there's something about continually overcoming it that is part of the kind of transcendence I'm talking about. Right? Not transcendence within the two worlds mythology, but a continual transcendence of it. That's non-completable. I totally grant that. And for me, that has deep analogy, maybe not even analogies, something stronger than analogy to what happens in love. You keep thinking you've got the person, and as soon as you do that, you've killed love, right? You have to get the person so that you're willing to give it up, so that you can get the person, so you're willing to give it up so that you get the person. That's the kind of thing I'm trying to point to. And it seems to me that is also the proper experience of time. It's like there's a giving that we receive in order to give it up so that we can receive, in order to give it up so that we can receive. And that's the connection I'm trying to draw. And so I totally agree. If people understand my project as John is trying to purify things, so we'll never do that.
No,
I'm not doing that at all. I'm not.
No.
Right. But I'm trying. But I am doing what I'm trying to propose to you right now.
Yes, and also to be able to see it. That's
Yes.
half the ticket, let's say.
Yeah.
To be because it is an issue that's again, it's fundamentally at the heart of the crisis.
Yes.
Is the collapse of that two-world paradigm, because it gave sustenance to the realm or the world of appearances, and
not without good reason. There was good reason why it was able to do that, right? Like you say, it fits into so much of how our experience like presents itself to us, upper and lower, our language. Yes, but that doesn't mean it hasn't collapsed. For me, that is part of the bite of the meaning crisis. Is like
that's that's the issue of our time, is that this is what I alluded to before. Where is philosophy now? For the most part, the tradition is fully available. We've not had Plato's texts and Parmenides' texts and Heraclitus's texts and everybody, Aristotle, everything. Type it in and you can read everything all at once. It doesn't mean that this access that's there in terms of pure availability is a genuine access to, yes, an access to the problems. And we can fight forever, whether Aristotle contradicts himself here or there. It doesn't. That actually doesn't matter. This is part of the simulation, as it were, of the simulacrum, if you like. After the collapse, there's some sort of impasse or embarrassment about what to do with the tradition. So let's just problematize all of it. Or as analytical philosophy tried in the beginning, let's just think history doesn't even exist anymore. But instead, we have to take seriously it has collapsed. We have to see also its merits, however.
Yes.
And at the same time, because it comes almost naturally. It used to be that we spoke of the metaphysical birthright of the human being, which is to say we're born in this dimension also. But that dimension doesn't speak to us anymore. I don't think it does. We try to replicate it technologically, perhaps also. But what we might perhaps get to or allow ourselves to open us up towards is the reading the tradition again in such a way that it's not pure intellect, academic interest, but it is genuinely, let's say, transformative. And transformative in a way that you can see it almost spreading, as it were. You can, and I mean, this is what philosophy is real. That's what what I mean by this. It's not Plato had a weird thought, and who cares? These thoughts carry the world in some sense. They make up. If you've never heard of Descartes, doesn't matter. You still live in a Cartesian world.
Yes.
And probably Descartes never read Parmenides. He still re-articulated the fundamental principle of Western philosophy, which is identity of being and thinking.
Yes.
So that's the weird thing about thinking is you don't have to have read everything. You still live in this world. So hence we have to find our own answer.
So my friend, I'm going to need to bring this to a close. I thought this was tremendously rich. I thought we made progress isn't quite the right word, but there was a lot that was unfolded and it kept weaving together, and it. But I just want to give you, like I do with all the guests on my channel, the opportunity to make the last word. It doesn't have to be summative or cumulative, but just your last word.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John. That should be it. And thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you so much, my friend. We'll be in touch. We'll be in touch, and we'll be in talk.
Yeah.
Again and again.